Okay, so this is going to be the last of the material for Unit 7, which includes McKay chapters 22 and 23. And I told you in class that the notes that you will find for this section basically say the rest of chapter 25. Even though it's chapter 23, that's how it's presented in the notes. The title of this is going to be Everybody 1871 to 1914. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to go from country to country and kind of look at where we left off for each of them and address how they're looking at their domestic politics. So the very top, it says Russia. This is just a continuation of the stuff that we were already looking on with Russia and the three R's. Just wanted to make note that nothing in this unit will cover Lenin. I mentioned Lenin in the last thing, but we're not really going to spend any time specifically with Lenin until we get to the Russian Revolution. In other words, you won't be tested on it, so don't worry about it for now. The battleship Potemkin, this came up in the notes. Just keep in mind that this is considered a very heroic event in Russian history. It was a sailor mutiny that occurred in 1905 and really precipitated Nicholas II granting what they called the October Manifesto. Eventually it would become a film, a propaganda film that was used in the Bolshevik or the Stalinist era as a means of talking about the heroes of the revolution, that the sailors that had fought on the battleship Potemkin were considered those heroes that fought in 1905. Remember that the October Manifesto was this promise. It was like an 1848 kind of thing that said, from Nicholas, that said we will guarantee, at least he said, freedom of person, conscience, assembly, and union. But that was the idea that they were going to grant a constitution and that they were going to create an assembly, which was called the Russian Duma. Those things happened, but remember that the fundamental laws that were passed shortly after gave a veto power that allowed Nicholas II to disband the Duma if the Duma got too crazy for his taste, and therefore kind of rendered them ineffective. So they really couldn't legislate in the fashion that they wanted to legislate. And those were the issues that were there as we approached 1914 in Russia. Not only that, but all of those bubbling up revolutionaries that I mentioned. Besides Lenin and the stuff that went down in London in 1903, where Russian Marxism actually had a summit to determine what fashion of Marxism would be most applicable in Russia, and that's where you found the Bolshevik-Menshevik split. A guy by the name of George Plekhanov was on the Menshevik end, and then of course Lenin and his supporters on the Bolshevik end. But you also had social revolutionaries, you had constitutional Democrats, you had anarchists, you had nihilists, you had a whole bunch of different flavors of revolution that were just waiting there. And that the World War I declaration in Russia seemed like it was almost a desperate attempt to at least get all of these revolutionary things off of the news cycle. So that's where Russia situates on the eve of World War I. And now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go country to country here and look at sort of, all right, well, what happened in Germany? When we last left off with Germany, Germany was having its victory parade down the streets of Paris, signing a treaty that ultimately recognizes Germany as a unified state, as an empire, and that declares the leader, William I, as the first German emperor, known as Kaiser. Okay, so Russia has Tsar, Germany has Kaiser. And so they created a two-house parliament, one that's dominated by the landed aristocracy, called the Bundesrat, and the other is the Reichstag. And the Reichstag obviously is much more familiar to you all. This is where Bismarck kind of gets out of his area. It's almost as if he had all of these chips that he cashed in craps, and now he's kind of meddling around in the roulette table, and that's domestic affairs, and that's not really something that's in his wheelhouse. So his brand of conservatism is obviously going to take some hits. Germany's industrialized, and that's certainly going to be something that he's going to have to reckon with. And he is a predominant Junker Protestant that's going to have to deal with the incorporation of German Catholics into this thing called unified Germany. And so the battles that Bismarck takes on for the next 20 years, between 1871 and when he finally is relieved of his duties, they call it dropping the pilot, that occurs in 1890, that he's going to have to first contest what he believes to be the loyalty of the people in the German Empire. And he starts to see the Catholics as being foils, if you will. So this battle, if you want to call it that, between Bismarck and his desire to get German allegiance to this emperor, and then Catholics and their ability to kind of do their own thing and worship the way that they worship, this is called Kulturkampf, which in German means struggle for civilization. All right, and so basically it's, like I said, Bismarck is kind of playing outside of his elements a little bit and reckons or realizes that the Catholics are a lot more dedicated and a lot stronger than he probably anticipated, and that he's picking really an unnecessary fight. Okay, his concern was that the Catholics would worship the Pope rather than the German emperor, and that there would be divisions if they didn't have some type of religious unity. He should have known better. Because, I mean, religion for all practical purposes is a really peripheral issue, particularly in mid to late 19th century Germany. All right? And if he would have gotten off of that right away, he would have recognized that, look, Catholic, Protestant, it doesn't really matter, and there's not really a papal threat to the German Empire. So him picking a fight with them made no sense, and it was ultimately going to backfire. Okay, so you'll read about these things they call the May Laws, which is him trying to put some kind of conservative halt on Catholic expression, and all it's going to end up doing is it's going to get Catholics more political than they probably would have been anyway. So they actually formed this thing called the Catholic Center Party, which was really an effort for the Catholics to be able to equip themselves to deal with Bismarck in a more effective way. And it proved to be very well strategized. The Catholic Center Party grows, and it's going to be something that Bismarck's going to have to deal with. And eventually, Bismarck realizes that there's a much bigger threat, he believes, to German conservatism, etc., than the Catholics. And that comes in the form of the socialists. In 1875, they formed what's called the Social Democratic Party. I'm going to talk about this at the end of this section, but it's called Evolutionary Socialism or Ballot Socialism. It's the next evolution to the belief that Marx's his dream of like a violent revolution that will overthrow the capitalist order, it never really needed to happen. All right, that there were accommodations that were made, and that socialists could form their own political parties, get seats in the representative assembly, and pass a socialist agenda through legislature. It's called democratic socialism. And the most vigorous and most prominent of these ballot socialist movements was the Social Democrats that formed in the 1870s in Germany. And yeah, it freaked Bismarck out. Okay? Because like I said, he's an old Junker conservative landowner. Socialism is ultimately aimed or targets property ownership as being the enemy of the people. So there's an antagonism that's never going to go away. All right, and there is a fear that whatever interests he might have as a landowning aristocrat and his brand of German conservatism is ultimately going to be threatened the more powerful that the Social Democratic Party gets. And unfortunately for him, everything that he does seems to backfire and only make the Social Democrats stronger. And this is unfortunately the sad end chapter of Bismarck. Because anything in foreign policy, he's like the anti-Napoleon Bonaparte III. Anything that he does in domestic policy seems to be pretty ineffective. All right, and this battle that he has with the Social Democrats, unfortunately, that's sort of like the last thing that we got to see from Bismarck. All right. So the first attempt that he took was the same attempt that he took against the Catholics, which was to try to ban them and frustrate their freedoms of assembly and censor their works and forbid, their meetings, etc., etc. This is called the anti-socialist laws of 1878, and it has no effect to do the things that Bismarck wanted it to do. It didn't curtail the growth or popularity of the Social Democrats. In fact, it seemed to make them stronger. So he takes a different tact, and this one was unbelievable. I call it, I learned from Great Britain cookie social legislation that Bismarck passes the most progressive social democratic agenda, maybe in European history, a health insurance, accident insurance, old age pensions, literally the first Social Security program. 50 years before the New Deal thinks of it, Bismarck thought of it. And the idea was, why do we need Social Democrats if I'm doing all this? Okay? So it's like I'll steal their agenda and I'll make it mine, kind of like what Hillary tried to do with Bernie Sanders by the time she got to the Democratic National Convention. Starting to sound a lot of Sanders-esque stuff that she may or may not have agreed with. All right, but Bismarck is Mr. New Deal here in an effort to say, if I steal their legislative platform, then who the hell wants to be a social democrat? It backfires. The Social Democrats continue to poll larger numbers and to start putting more people into the Reichstag. At this point, Bismarck's almost on the agenda of, I'm going to go old school on these guys and I'm going to disband them. Like literally remove the Social Democrats from the Reichstag. If he does that, they're probably going to face some kind of civil war. All right? So he never gets a chance to do that because he gets fired before it does. That would have been a really bad legacy for him. Okay, we might look at him differently. But the guy that replaces him, Kaiser Wilhelm II, alias the Bonehead, one of the reasons that he got rid of Bismarck was that he believed that Bismarck was stained in his relationship with the Social Democrats, and that if they removed that piece, that maybe he would be able to deal with them in a more effective way. And so Bismarck's let go. And he continues to do Bismarckian things in terms of more progressive social democratic legislation. But by the time we get to World War I, the Social Democrats are the largest party in the Reichstag. And Kaiser Wilhelm, it's like I said, it's almost like, what do we do? I mean, how are we going to be able to deal with the idea that there is a socialist upsurge among the German working class, and it is now a dominant political voice in our legislature? And you have to ask yourself, is Germany a little bit too enthusiastic about starting the war, and might this be one of the ulterior motives? All right. So let's take a look at Italy. Maybe even more so here. Italy post-unification, and remember, the original unification was 1861, but it didn't include Rome and it didn't include Venice. When Bismarck picks his fight with Austria, that's when they acquired Venice. That was in 1866. And when Bismarck picks his fight with France, that's when France gets Rome. Okay, so now Italy geographically is united by 1871, including Venice, including Rome, and now they have to get about the business of being a country and working on what they need to work on. Okay, how do they do? Not so well. And here are some of the reasons why. The first thing is that Italy does not concentrate on the right things. Rather than them building a stable, commercially viable, financially stable, peaceful and stable country, they would rather play the role of European power. It was like they wanted to concentrate on foreign affairs and they ignored their domestic affairs. So they really weren't equipped to be a major European power, but they felt like they should be treated like one. So ultimately they take on this little dog role, and I'll explain that little dog analogy a little bit later, where they feel like they should be at the big boy table, but they really don't belong at the big boy table yet. And had they spent a decade or two really building up their domestic policies, the way that Camillo Cavour had done in Sardinia, Piedmont, then they might have been in a better spot. They didn't do it. Okay? So, Italy is a kingdom. They ultimately settle on a constitutional monarchy. The Sardinia Piedmontese king, Victor Emmanuel II, is the first Italian king. And the plan that they had in place in 1848, it's called the Statuto of 1848, is ultimately the platform that they're going to use. So you have a constitutional monarchy, you have a two-house legislature, you have a king, and then you have a prime minister, or a premier. Okay? So you have a Senate, and you have a Chamber of Deputies. The power really is held by the old landowning aristocrats, unfortunately. Okay? The other thing is that it's not going to work right away for a variety of reasons. First, the North and the South are kind of different places. All right? The South is almost like a feudalistic, like agrarian state. When you look at Naples or Sicily or those sort of areas, they're dramatically different than what you would see from a Lombardy or a Milan or a Venice. All right? And to put those two territories together, it didn't match, and it was going to be very difficult to try to create a cultural unity that works. They're diametrically different places, and so it was like putting those pieces together in the puzzle really didn't make a lot of sense at the very beginning. Okay. The second was that they didn't have the fortune of sitting on a bed of resources the way that a Germany or a Britain or a Russia did, where you have major coal deposits or iron ore deposits or fertile soil that would make them a breadbasket. Okay, the soil was old and it was rocky and it was kind of eroded, which means that they're going to have to rely on a lot of imports of things that other people don't have to rely on imports for. Okay, and that kind of sets them back. The second thing is the resistance from the church, and that had been there from the get-go. That when Pope Pius IX, a Mr. Reactionary Conservative, was fighting tooth and nail from the get-go on any plan for German or for Italian unification, and that was going to be the case during the 1848 revolutions, when Napoleon had sort of befriended Camillo Cavour and said, "We'll help you with this." That he had been diametrically opposed, wanted to control the papal states, and did not want to see Italian unification because he knew that ultimately that was going to take his power away. All right. After it happened, after unification happened, Pope Pius basically became what they call the prisoner of the Vatican. It's almost like a child that didn't get his way, that locked himself in his room and said, "No, I'm not coming out." And they're like, "Come on, Pope. Everybody loves you." They're like, "No, you people go away. You did something that I didn't like, and I'm going to sit here and I'm going to stew about it." They even tried to pass legislation that would have created the Vatican. This is called the Law of Papal Guarantees in 1871. All right, would have made it a sovereign state. Said, "Hey, Pope, you can be the head of Vatican City. This would be amazing. All right, you could be the king, you could be the emperor, whatever the hell you want to call yourself. And we'll even give you like $600,000 worth of compensation annually for the territories that you lost, the so-called papal states." And he's like, "No, not satisfied." And they're like, "Pope, you're not being reasonable." He's like, "I don't care." All right? That's a problem, because he's still the Pope. And Roman Catholics still recognize him as the head of the church. I mean, he's the Church of St. Peter. I mean, he's the descendant of freaking St. Peter. So he still carries a lot of weight, particularly among the Catholics. And Italy is full of Catholics. So if you have the Pope that is antagonized by the very creation of this unified Italy with a king and everything else, and the Pope hates it, it puts the Catholics in a real tough spot. Okay? It's tough to find unity. It's tough to get people to rally around it when the Pope is saying anybody that supports this is not a friend of mine. So they had to deal with that. Okay? You literally watch in Italy the years that go by in the period between like the 1880s and up to World War I, and it's just bad news after bad news. In 1893, peasant revolts in Sicily. 1894, riots in Milan. That means that the rural peasantry is not doing well. That means that the urban worker is not doing well. Worker strikes throughout. They were much more radical in Italy than they were in a lot of other places. They didn't just have ballot socialists. They had what they call anarcho-syndicalists. Okay? These are much more violent, more direct action-oriented folks. That's what Italy had on their plate. Okay? Combinations of anarchism, worker-based anarchism, direct action activists, and there was a lot of stuff going on. And the capper on this was the assassination of their leader, King Umberto I. Okay? There was an administrator, a premier, if you will. His name was Giovanni Giolitti, who tried, some liberal and more progressive things to try to improve the plight of the working class, improve the plight of the peasantry, but it just wasn't enough. And so Italy on the eve of World War I is a mess. Okay, you've got viable working class antagonism here. You've got, some cultural differences between the North and the South. You've got the Catholic in the battles that were going on there. They're just not in very good shape. So you ask your question: why would Italy be kind of gung ho about entering into World War I? I think you've got your answers. Okay. At the very end, I just gave you, there is kind of like this interesting back and forth between the popes. You know how Russia was like, you got a reformer, then you got a reactionary. In the Roman Catholic Church, you had those two. You got Mr. Reactionary, Pope Pius the Ninth. Just to give you an example, in 1864, he wrote this, remember the bulls? Right? He's got one of those, all right, called Syllabus of Errors. All right, and in 1864, he is literally saying a lot of the same things that Boniface VIII was saying in 1302 with Unum Sanctum. Was arguments about how there's papal infallibility. When the Pope speaks, the Pope is talking in God's voice. And if it was a laughingstock to French kings in 1302, imagine what kind of laughingstock it is in 1864 as Europe has gone through all kinds of modernization. I mean, this dude is living like Don Quixote style, right? And eventually, once he's done, the next guy that comes in recognizes it. Like the church, dude, you need to get into the 19th century. I mean, geez, you need to get into the 14th century. All right? And he does. And he passes this, or he writes this thing called Rerum Novarum, which means concerning new things. And this is the point where the church really kind of recognizes that they're in a different world. All right? And that they're starting to become the Catholics of modern times, where they're taking on the causes of working class people and people that are oppressed and that sort of thing. And so Leo the 13th becomes that guy. All right? That the church it's almost like they're fighting for the hearts and minds of the working class with the Marxists, but the difference is the Marxists were atheistic. And so it's like, if we can take on that mantle, but keep them in God's favor, then maybe we can win that fight for hearts and minds. And then just before, World War I, the next guy that comes in, his name is Pius X, he takes an anti-modernist oath. Like, what the hell does that mean? It means that they're going to go backward a couple of steps. So instead of having this nice logical progression towards the 20th century, the church is kind of mired in this one step forward, two steps backward. It's almost like, even you can make some of those arguments about our recent popes. Francis seems like he's more of a Leo the 13th type of guy. All right, Benedict, the guy that came before him, maybe more of a Pius X kind of guy. All right, so the church is still growing, or going through some growing pains. All right, so on to France. And when we last left off with France, Napoleon crapped out. All right, remember that he got literally baited into a war with Bismarck's Germany, and they were going to lose. And when they did, Napoleon eventually gets captured in a battle, and that's it. That's the end of Empire number 2. Empire number 1 was the original Napoleon, from 1804 to 1814, and a little bit of 1815. And then the second empire was from 1852 to 1870. Okay, now they're out of bullets, and now we got to go back to the drawing board. As if France has never been in this situation before, they got to figure out a new government. All right, and there were battles. All right, they even had another June Days revolt because they were fearful that moderates or conservatives were going to take over the new government, and it was going to shut the working class out of the legislature. It was called the Paris Commune, and it was literally like watching another June Day revolt. It gets crushed the same way the June Days revolt did, and it's another, in the thousands in terms of dead. All right, so France just can't seem to make seamless transition. There's always violence, and so eventually we end up with, they're going to backlash. They're going to backlash against the fact that we had another Napoleon that dragged us into another abyss, another war that we ended up losing, and that one was embarrassing because we lost Alsace and Lorraine, and we had to pay an indemnity. We had to watch German soldiers marching in our streets, and everybody's in a bad mood. So they decide on a third republic, but there was even conversations that they were going to try to return back to monarchy. All right? They even found a guy. His name was the Count of Chambord, and said, "Hey, would you like to be the new king?" And he's like, "No, I refuse to accept a crown from the gutter." And the French are looking at this dude like, "You're serious about this?" And so what they finally settled on was the Third Republic. And the reason why they did was they called it the government that divides us least. It was almost like they settled on it. But you actually had conservatives that wanted to bring back monarchy, as if, they had done that and it worked. Every time they did it, it ended up sucking. But they wanted to go back to monarchy because they thought, well, maybe monarchy's better than more Napoleons. I don't know, try a republic and actually try it and see if it works out. But there's a lot of baggage with the republic. Okay? Ultimately, it's the republic that had to deal with those terms of peace that were thrown down at the Treaty of Frankfurt. It's a republic that had to pay indemnities. It's a republic that lost Alsace and Lorraine. It's a republic that got embarrassed by the Germans. Okay? And out of those ashes, it's going to be very hard. France's pride is wounded. All right, and the Republic is constantly going to be vulnerable about nationalist calls to try to revenge what took place in the Franco-Prussian War. Okay? So anyway, you'll read on, there's some people, they mentioned Jules Ferry, Leon Gambetta. These are strong parliamentary leaders. Okay, presidents, if you will, of this Third Republic. And so, they're getting their game back together in the 1870s and 80s. But one of the lessons learned here is that the Republic is always going to be on shaky ground. That's what it says in the notes. What are the threats to the Third Republic? Is the Third Republic going to be able to navigate its way up to World War I? Will it be successful? And there were some indicators that it wouldn't be. Okay? One of them was this thing called the Bollinger Affair, where a very fiery kind of captive or popular figure arises that is starting to appeal to the sentiments of the people. And those sentiments are all based on the fact that Germany embarrassed them, and we need to revenge that embarrassment. And so there's this guy named George Bollinger that pops up, and his big catchphrase is, "They wait for us at Alsace." And so there was entertainment that this general, George Bollinger, was going to get military forces and a whole bunch of people, nationalists, that were going to overthrow the Republic, put in some type of military-esque, authoritarian leadership that would then raise the troops and go to Alsace and take it back. And so it got people curious. But when they finally discovered the plot, they were going to arrest him, and I think he ended up killing himself. But it was there. That always was going to be in the back of people's heads, is things like they wait for us at Alsace, or how do we allow these French territories to be occupied by Germans, and what the hell is the Third Republic doing about it? All right, so that's out there. All right, and that's going to be a big one. Okay, another example of this, and this is where the antagonism of the post-Franco-Prussian War era France meets good old-fashioned French anti-Semitism. It all comes in the form of this thing called the Dreyfus Affair. Big national scandal at the very end of the 1890s in France. This figure, his name is Captain Alfred Dreyfus. He's Jewish. And so apparently what ended up happening was he was brought up on charges of treason. In other words, he had been selling military secrets to the German army, and that's why the French lost to the Germans. All right. So they have this show trial, this military trial, where Dreyfus is brought up on all these charges, and there was a whole bunch of sketch, like investigation and like proof that like Dreyfus had somehow sold all these secrets, and they pinned this treason on Dreyfus and convicted him. And then everybody was kind of like, at least smart people were kind of like, whoa. This was sketch. And maybe this Dreyfus guy is a pawn or a patsy that's being fed, so that French people can feel better about themselves. Why not find this great Jewish scapegoat and say, the Jews are the reason why the French lost to the Germans? It's going to be interesting how that script gets flipped. But it always reverts back to the Jews are the reason that ... And so Dreyfus would be the sacrificial lamb. So French, humiliation and French anti-Semitism have a nice, landing ground. Anyway, long story short, they go back into the investigation, and as they're going through it, they realize that the guy that actually was treasonous was this figure named Major Esterhazy, almost flat out admitted that he was the reason, or he was the source of all of these documents, or whatever the case was. All the stuff that got pinned on Dreyfus was actually somebody else. Dreyfus was completely innocent. So they had a second trial, and they still found Dreyfus guilty. So this guy ends up getting convicted and has to serve in this Devil's Island or wherever the hell it is. And eventually it becomes like this massive, dividing point in French society. It was almost like the OJ trial, where everybody that believed OJ was guilty was on one side, and everybody that thought OJ was being set up by the LAPD was on the other side. And Dreyfus had that kind of thing where there's a dividing line, and all these people that were pro-army, anti-Semite, old conservatives were like, Dreyfus is guilty, and intelligent people that realized that he was basically set up. A lot of Republican, more liberal-esque type of people, writers, other intellectuals were like, no, this is completely a case of finding a sacrificial lamb. There's even a great writer in France, his name was Émile Zola, who wrote this tract called J'accuse. And J'accuse was basically, I accuse the French army, I accuse the French conservatives of literally just convicting an innocent person, in this trial. And eventually, out of all of this water, they find out that Dreyfus is innocent. This is a dude. I mean, you read about this guy. He was wrongfully convicted twice by his country. And yet, when World War I rolls around, he re-enlists in the army and ends up fighting and gets decorated again. I mean, that's a guy that, talk about, forgive and forget. Damn. That's a good one. But Alfred Dreyfus was at least a symptom of another threat to the Third Republic. And out of it, I guess one good came that France finally separated church and state. Okay, because the Catholics were like big time against Dreyfus, and that they thought that maybe some of the religious issues were at play here, and it turned out that by early 1900s they got rid of the Concord out of 1801, which was proposed by Napoleon. And separated church and state finally, okay, in France. The other thing is that France has got to deal with the same thing that Germany, Italy, Britain, and everybody else does. They've got to worry about the fact that the working class does not feel adequately addressed in French politics. I mean, that's an old story. I mean, the thing go back to the Sans-Culottes. But you've got organizations now. You've got their ballot socialists that were called the United Socialist Party. And you'll read about them and their formation. And they're a loud voice that says we need to be incorporated into the legislature. And you had other direct action-oriented people. There was this group called the Confédération Générale du Travail. And then you had this group of anarcho-syndicalists in France. And so there is some pretty radical working class elements here that the Third Republic is going to have to deal with. So you got all of the stains of the Franco-Prussian War. You've got the rise of workers' movements and the intensity of those workers' movements. Anarchists floating around. You got all of the bad blood that was the result of the Dreyfus affair. And there's a whole lot of stuff that's going on in France on the eve of World War I. Ask yourself, is France's enthusiasm to get involved in this major war a way of maybe putting all of those other things off of the front page of the paper? Who knows? Austria-Hungary, this one's a little bit more, a little bit quieter, but basically, so Austria loses the war, the 7 Weeks War, and they're no longer a voice in German affairs. And the fact that they got beaten as badly as they did by Bismarck and the North German Confederation, or whatever you want to call it, it only added, I guess, it invited the subject nationalities that envelop the Austrian Empire to start pining for their own rights. And the loudest of the subject nationalities, of course, is the Hungarians. The Hungarians, have hated their incorporation with the Austrian Empire dating back to 1699. They had a major uprising in 1703. They had uprisings throughout the early 1800s. A major uprising in 1848 led by Louis Kossuth. And now they're back at it because, the weakness of the Austrian military was exposed during the 7 Weeks War. So their advocacy to be a separate thing gets louder and louder as the 1860s roll through. And eventually what we get to is what they call Ausgleich. And this is in 1867, and it's the formation of what they call the dual monarchy. So the period in history from 1867 to 1918, Austria will be referred to as Austria-Hungary. All right, and anybody that studied the World War I, they were always like, "What the hell is Austria-Hungary?" This is where it starts. Okay, and it's kind of a middle ground. Okay, Hungary, for all practical purposes, has got control over its own stuff. All right, but they will share a foreign policy and they'll share a military with Austria. Okay, and then the last point that it says here is why. Okay, so that solves the problem with Hungary. They've made a compromise. It's called Austria-Hungary, but does that address Bohemia, which also, since the days of John Huss, has been proposing to not be part or to be an independent thing? Does it address other groups, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, and a variety of other subject nationalities that are still part of this thing called Austria-Hungary? Okay? It's not just Austrians and it's not just Hungarians. And the subject nationality thing is what makes Austria-Hungary as an entity very vulnerable. They're on the border of the Balkans. And the Balkans is the powder keg. Right? If you've ever heard of that. I mean, that's the dynamite that's waiting to blow up. And a multinational empire in a period of intense nationalism is a very vulnerable thing. Okay, so that's where Austria-Hungary is. And they had no choice but to fight the war. I mean, literally, it starts in their backyard. All right, so quick on Great Britain, and then we're going to try to wrap some of this stuff up. Great Britain, remember I told you, goes on this nice little evolution away from old school conservatism. Remember we talked about the Corn Laws, and then the Peterloo Massacre and the Tories dominating Parliament, and then eventually we watched them tweak and start to shift, and to do it in order to avoid violent confrontation. So they ended up, like the Liberals or the Whigs ended up gaining control over governance. They passed reform bills, the Reform Bill of 1832 that gave the vote to the middle class. Then they got child labor laws like the Factory Act of 1833, and then the 10 Hours Act, and then the Mines Act, and a handful of other things. They became free traders, developed a police force. They did a lot of cool stuff in the 1830s and 40s, and then they took a break. Okay? The Chartists who rose never really got to finish, their goal of having, a full-on voice in the political process. So that got tabled. And this period between 1850 and 1865 is a period known as the Victorian Compromise. It's sort of like, look, a whole bunch of good stuff happened in the 1830s and 40s. Now we're going to just kind of chill and rest on our laurels a little bit. But then it picks up again after 1865. All right? And the good part is that it's like the Progressive era, sort of, in American history, where it didn't matter what political party was in charge, progressive legislation passed no matter what. Okay? So the first thing and there's two figures that dominate this era. One's name is a conservative, a Tory, by the name of Benjamin Disraeli, and the other is a liberal by the name of William Gladstone. And from 1865, literally until the 1890s, these are the two dominant figures in British politics. Both of them served, multiple terms as prime ministers. They were their party's leaders, whether it was the Whigs or the Tories or the Liberals and the Conservatives, whatever you want to call them. Okay, the first thing that passes is by the Tory party leader Benjamin Disraeli, who got legislation passed called the Reform Bill of 1867. And what that did was it finally gave the working class the right to vote, urban workers. So now almost everybody, at least men, have the right to vote in Great Britain except for rural workers or rural laborers. All right? And eventually they'll get in. All right? After this reform bill, the Liberal William Gladstone takes over as Prime Minister, and it's known in this 6-year period as the Great Ministry. And you watch the stuff that's passed. It's just like one cool progressive piece of legislation after another. There's the Education Act of 1870 that creates school boards and creates subsidies for private schools and compulsory education that's going to be mandated and paid for by the government. The secret ballot is passed in 1872. That was one of the big Chartist demands. They already got demand number one, which was suffrage. Okay? They formed labor unions and legalized the right to strike. Then Disraeli wins. And instead of it going reverting back like the Russians do, where you do reforms and then you do reaction, they just kept doing reforms. So the next period, which is known as Tory democracy, is under Benjamin Disraeli, and they passed a bunch of other stuff. Right, one of them was a Factory Act in 1875, going to provide a whole bunch more rights and protections for the working class. Then a Public Health Act, which was going to look at sanitary conditions on top of the stuff that was already passed in the 1840s. Then they had an Artisans' Dwellings Act, which was like low-income housing. All right, and then workmen's compensation in 1875, which meant if you got hurt or on the job, that you'd be protected. Okay, and all of this ultimately culminates in universal suffrage, which Britain gets in 1884. Okay, then we get towards the end, the beginning of the 20th century, and there's one battle that finally happens, and it happens off of what they call the Robin Hood taxes. These are things that American conservatives still hate. One is called the capital gains tax. The other is called the inheritance tax. And then the third is the income tax. And the idea was that in 1909, there was a finance minister, later on a much bigger figure, but his name was David Lloyd George. And they wanted to increase this budget in order to be able to pay for more social welfare legislation, and it was going to come in the form of capital gains tax, income tax, and inheritance tax. Now, if you think about it, all of those taxes are going to be aimed at rich folks. The only ones that really gain, by investments or whatever, capital gains, or stand to get a big inheritance, or have higher income so that they can be taxed in brackets. Okay, so these are things that the United States hasn't even entertained yet. That doesn't come until the almost after World War I. But so the budget then is designed on these Robin Hood taxes that are going to raise a whole bunch more funds, and then they could use those funds and appropriate those towards more social welfare legislation. Well, this is finally where the House of Lords, which is the old landowning aristocrats, dominated by Tories, finally they say enough is enough. They're like, whoa, time out. We're not doing this anymore. Okay? Now, before they can deal with giving people the right to vote, but this is actually eating into their finances. Okay? And so that's where they finally say, no, we veto, we're not going to get this passed. And it ends up creating this massive parliamentary battle, because there's all these folks that want this budget appropriated. And so it's almost like a standstill. Are we going to be able to meet this budget or not? And eventually the king jumps in, and the king eventually says, you know what, I'm going to pack the House of Lords full of people that are going to vote for this if you don't pass it. And so eventually they get the money appropriated, and after that, the House of Commons passes what's called the Parliament Act, which basically is if we pass a piece of legislation with this amount of vote, the House of Lords cannot override it. Right? So it renders the House of Lords useless. Okay, they no longer can wield the power to stop legislation by simply being. It's finally the end of aristocracy in Great Britain is in 1911. Okay, and then here's what they do. In 1906, there's a Workmen's Compensation Act. In 1909, there's an Old Age Pensions Act. That's Social Security. In 1911, the Parliament Act, which I mentioned. In 1911, the National Insurance Act. The U.S. still doesn't have a national insurance. Okay, remember Obamacare and how horrible that was? Well, this is single-payer national insurance. In 1912, a minimum wage law. We still fight against minimum wage laws in this country. They had one in Britain before World War I. Okay? So they are on a fast track towards modern social democracy. All right? They are living the dream. Okay? And the only thing that you have to keep in mind here is that, all right, well, everything that you've mentioned so far, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Italy, France, Germany, they're all kind of, I don't know, they're at least a little bit vulnerable. They've got groups that agitate, and they threaten their governing structure. So they might want to go to war, to try to divert attention away from the problems that they have at home. Well, Britain also brazenly declared war. And they sound like they're doing pretty good. So what are their hang-ups? And that's where we have two things. One of them is the women's question, which we've dealt with. Okay? That when they declared universal suffrage in Great Britain in 1884, it excluded women. That's more than 50% of the population, and women are not going to sit idly by with no voice and no protection. And that's why I said, the dynamic, because the idea that women should be able to participate in political affairs has been around, at least since Mary Wollstonecraft, but maybe even further back than that. And that the kind of activism that exists in Britain on the eve of World War I is not, write a poem or, march in formation. These are activists. These are radical activists in some cases. And remember, I even said a woman that would jump out in the middle of a derby and allow herself to be trampled to death in order to elicit an emotional response that says women demand suffrage. Well, Britain, as far along as they are, have not addressed this issue. And so it is definitely going to hang on them. The other one is the Irish question. Okay? And this one is growing in intensity a lot more, too. All right? We mentioned in the first half of the 19th century that at least there was one thing that was done, and that was in 1829 that there was what's called the Catholic Emancipation Act, where you actually allowed actual authentic Irish voices to take their seats in the British Parliament and advocate for the things that they cared about. The things they cared about the most were A, home rule, where they could rule themselves and not be considered subject nationalities to Great Britain or whatever that is, recognizing that Great Britain could give a rat's ass about them, at least as far as they were concerned, as they were dying off by the hundreds of thousands in the Irish potato famine. So those movements for Irish home rule are going to get bigger, more diverse. Their tactics would become a lot more radical. It's kind of like what we're watching in Russia, okay, where the demands are loud, and as they get silenced, those voices are going to get louder, and their demands are going to become a lot more militant. All right. So you not only have the Repeal Association, which is about the most vanilla version of Irish Home Rule movements, but then you also had the Young Ireland movement. Then you had a New York-based movement called Fenianism, led by John O'Mahony and Michael Doheny. I told you at one time there's probably more Irish in New York and Boston than there was in Ireland. And so these movements, as the Irish became more embedded in New York and Boston and started to increase wealth and prestige, they started to bankroll a lot of these Irish nationalist movements from the States. And then you started to see Sinn Féin and then the formations of what ultimately would become the Irish Republican Army. Okay? There was even advocates in Britain that said, yeah, we get it. Things need to happen. All right, so there was land reform bills that were passed by the British Parliament in 1870, 1881, and then 1903. And William Gladstone even proposed that there would be home rule legislation. But it could not gain any traction. And remember, the reason why is because there was a lot of absentee landowners, Welsh, Scottish, and English landowners that had, property in England or in Ireland, and then also that they had a fear of what reprisals might fall on them if the Irish controlled their own country. All right? And this isn't unfamiliar, but remember that Ireland is a predominantly Catholic country, dominated by Britain, which is a predominantly Protestant country. All right? And you have hundreds of years of hatred between those two groups that has yet to play itself out. So the fear, of course, is going to be that if you looked at some of the counties in Ireland, the makeup is like 90-10 Catholic to Protestant. But if you looked at a couple of territories in the very top, in this region that they called Ulster, the divisions are a little bit more symmetrical. It's about 55-45 in favor of the Protestants. Okay? And it's there where you saw backlash. There was a fear of breaking away from the Union, of breaking away from Great Britain, because now in an incorporated Ireland, those Protestants become a very distinct minority. And there was concerns about the backlash that might be committed against those Irish Protestants. All right. And these are the regions which ultimately now we know that to be Northern Ireland. But the region was called Ulster, and you found people that were organized and were as political pro-union as the folks were for home rule. So much so that they were on the verge of civil war before World War I broke out. And that is a much bigger deal for Britain to deal with than, to kind of, table it. I guess you would even say that the Irish question was so tumultuous that they did the war probably just to get it off of the pages. Right? We got to table that fight because that definitely is a fight that's going to come to fruition in some way. And we'll see this, that as we get into World War I, when the war starts to get, bogged down, Ireland's one of the first places that's going to blow up. All right, and that's like they call it the Easter Rebellion. That's in 1916. The war's only half over before the Irish say, "Well, we're not going to take this anymore. We are going to deal with this home rule question, and we're going to deal with it now." Okay, so then the last bit. You can read about this. It talks about like in the notes, Sir Edward Carson and James Craig and this group called the Unionists. That's the antithesis to the Arthur Griffith and the Sinn Féin and some of the more radical pro-home rule organizations. That there's real clash that's happening, particularly in this region that they call Ulster. All right, so the last bit is evolutionary socialism. And like I said, there was this belief in the 1840s by Marx and Engels in particular that capitalism itself was so sinister and so parasitic for the capitalist class that they had to prey on the working class in order to be able to survive, that those contradictions themselves historically and inevitably would lead to a violent uprising by the working class that would overthrow that order and replace it with a communist final state. But then remember, the cookie folks got involved, the modern liberals, okay, the ones that said, hey, here, have this universal suffrage, or we'll legalize your ability to form a labor union, or we'll pass out a 10-hour workday, or we'll give you workman's compensation, or we'll give you some kind of old age pension if you put enough money in, whatever the case is. And it started to look like, because the working class was doing better at the end of the 19th century, that this prediction that Marx had for the inevitability of a violent revolution to overthrow the capitalist order, that it didn't need to happen. All right. So modifications were made amongst the socialists that shifted from bullet to ballot. Okay. And one of the leading voices in this is this guy named Edward Bernstein, who wrote a book called Evolutionary Socialism, which was that. It was literally like, it was an answer to Marx that said, this does not have to be the method to get to socialism. The better method would be that socialism occurs organically and democratically. So what you saw take place was, in all of these advanced industrialized countries, was the formation of ballot socialists. Okay, we already mentioned the Social Democrats and Ferdinand Lassalle in Germany. But we also, and I think we mentioned the United Socialists in France, Jules Guesda and Jean Jaurès. In Britain, they were called the Fabian Socialists. This is the precursor to the Labour Party in Britain, Fabian Socialism. And the leaders of that, there was a bunch, but the two voices that were the loudest for ballot socialism in Britain were Sidney and Beatrice Webb. There were others like H.G. Wells, the author of The Time Machine, and others that were what we call ballot socialists in Britain. But eventually, there is this formidable thing called the Labour Party. And that's how it starts in the 1880s and 90s. The book that Beatrice and Sidney Webb wrote was called The History of Trade Unionism. All right, and that became kind of a point of contention with Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, V.I. Lenin, because he was in London around the same time. And a lot of Lenin's ideas were kind of formulated off of his hatred of the arguments that Sidney and Beatrice Webb were making about trade unionism. That like the working class becomes an advocacy group instead of what they could actually be. All right. I also mentioned to you that there was other groups that were not as democratic as the the ballot socialists. There was groups like I mentioned the Confédération Générale de Travail in France, the anarcho-syndicalists in Italy and France, and then there was a group called the Erfurt Program, led by this guy named Karl Kautsky and August Bebel in Germany in 1891. So there is more direct action-oriented socialists that are still in the hopper. But it seems like in Western Europe, like Marx has kind of lost its edge. And it's sad because Marx probably made a hell of a lot more sense in Britain or Germany or France or Italy than it did in Russia. Russia would have been the last place that Marx would have seen to be the geographical entry point of the Marxian revolution. All right, so but that's where we are, and that's really it for this unit. So like I said in class today, if you've seen this or the Russia or the Bismarck lectures today, or over the next couple of days, please make sure that you look through them and bring questions. Make sure that you're reading some of the supplementary stuff, so that if you have any specific things that you came across either on this thing or in the reading, that you answer those or you ask those questions and that you get them answered. But as far as any of that goes, I guess we're kind of done. And then over the next few days, we'll kind of play around with the review. And then the plan, of course, is that Monday and Tuesday we'll have our tests. Multiple choice and short answer on Monday. And then I'll give you some in-class essay topics for Tuesday. So that is all. I will talk to you tomorrow. Stop.